I'm Jesse Ventura. Stay vigilant, question more. Welcome to my world. Come along for the ride. The world according to Jesse. Ajamu Baraka is the national organizer for the Black Alliance for Peace. He was also the Green Party's vice presidential candidate in 2016. He joins me now from the Big Apple, New York City. Ajamu, you've been involved with many anti-war and human rights movements. Talk about your role in the Black Alliance for Peace. What is it, and what issues does this organization focus on?
Well, first, thank you so much, Governor, for allowing me to join you this afternoon. You are someone that I have always admired as being a voice for sanity and for truth. The Black Alliance for Peace is a new alliance that we saw the necessity for attempting to rebuild the traditional anti-war movement here in this country by organizing the population, the community that has been the most consistently anti-war and pro-peace community in this country, and that is the Black community. We knew that there had been a shift in the Black community under the 8 years of the Obama administration that has shifted opinion more toward what we call the right, more towards support for militarism and the permanent war agenda. But with the end of the Obama administration, we thought this was the perfect opportunity to try to reclaim that moral and political position among Black folks. And we saw this as important, Governor, because we saw the Black Alliance for Peace as being a very important weapon in helping to revive the broader anti-war movement here in this country. So this alliance is part of that effort to rebuild and revive the broader anti-war movement. Our concerns are with putting a break on U.S. militarism and the permanent war agenda, and in building a powerful instrument that can begin or continue the process of shifting power back from the elite to the people.
Well, I'll tell you, my hero, Muhammad Ali, when I grew up, he was my hero because he stood up when they wanted to draft him into the military, and he was a man of conviction, and he lost his title because of it. But I've always admired him because of that. You have a petition to shut down the U.S. Africa Combatant Command known as AFRICOM. For those who don't know, what is AFRICOM's role on the continent, and why are you against it?
Well, Governor, this attempt that we are organizing now to shut down AFRICOM, we're calling on the U.S. to leave the African continent and to shut down its forward deployment bases. This is part, though, of a broader effort, as we talked about a moment ago. We are part of a coalition that was launched back in January to close all U.S. foreign bases, to bring the personnel home, to reallocate the $156 billion being used for forward deployment, and use that money toward addressing the human rights and human needs of people in the U.S. So the focus on AFRICOM is part of that campaign to close down U.S. foreign bases. We thought that as the Black Alliance for Peace, though, that we should have a specific kind of focus on the African continent. You know, Governor, as you know, most people don't know that the U.S. has mapped out the entire globe, and you have all these various command structures. And AFRICOM is really the newest one for the African continent. So we say U.S. should be out of Africa. We say make Africa a zone of peace, bring those resources and personnel back to the U.S., and let's build peace back in the U.S. as opposed to promoting conflict and war on the African continent, or really any place.
I'll tell you, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, where do I sign up? I'm not Black, but I want to sign up. As part of the petition,
you're part of the movement.
You've asked the Congressional Black Caucus to conduct hearings on AFRICOM. What is the status of that request? What have they done?
We are now trying to secure a meeting with the Congressional Black Caucus, and we target the Congressional Black Caucus, again, because of the principles of accountability. At one point, the Congressional Black Caucus was part of that alliance of forces that always questioned U.S. policy and U.S. Foreign policies. But we know over the last few decades, they have shifted to the right. So we're saying that in the name of accountability, that the Congressional Black Caucus should take up its traditional role by representing the objective interests of African people or black people who are opposed to U.S. War and imperialism. And we want them to call hearings to look at the impact of the expansion of AFRICOM on the African continent. It's important to point out that AFRICOM is only 10 years old. We just celebrated, if you will, the 10th anniversary, October the 1st. It was established October 1st, 2008, right before Obama assumed the presidency. So we're saying that if you look at what has occurred on the African continent, there's been a 1,900% increase in the military presence on the African continent, and has not always been very positive. So we want to see hearings to take a look at the impact of U.S. militarism on the African continent.
Now, I got to jump in here. In recent years, America's military presence has rapidly grown in Africa. And I can't believe this. Last year, the Pentagon confirmed there were over 3,500 missions and nearly 6,000 troops on the ground. What do these missions consist of, and why don't we hear about them? And don't we have to declare war to do that? How are they allowed to send military operationally into Africa without the Congress voting on it?
Without the Congress voting on it, and we might recall, your listeners may recall, that when those 4 military personnel were killed in Niger, most Congress persons didn't even know that there was a mission in that country. Well, that's part of the lack of accountability, Governor, that we've seen with the Congress, that they have basically given the Pentagon and the executive carte blanche to do whatever it would like to do. They have stretched the authorization to use military force coming out of the so-called war on terror to its limits and really beyond its limits. So the legal justification theoretically is supposed to be to counter terrorism on the African continent. But we have seen that with the increased presence of the U.S. on the African continent, we have not seen a reduction in so-called terrorism, but in fact an expansion. And the key to that, Governor, was when they destroyed the Libyan state and allow for arms from Libya to proliferate across the African continent and even also into Syria.
I'll tell you, blowback is unbelievable, and this country needs to know about that. Now, do African countries oppose AFRICOM?
Well, you know, that is an interesting question. Most of the African countries pretended to be opposed to AFRICOM up until 2011. And what happened in 2011? Well, Muammar Gaddafi had assumed the presidency of the African Union, which is the continental-wide political structure. And everyone pretended to be opposed to AFRICOM. But when NATO launched its war against Libya in 2011 and basically destroyed that state, as a consequence of that, there's been an opening of the arms by a number of African states to AFRICOM. Today we see military-to-military relations with 53 of the 54 African countries. So there's been a dramatic proliferation, and as you indicated in your comment a few minutes ago, a dramatic presence on the African continent, all in the name of the war on terror. But we know that the real objective with the African governments, many of them, is to have a powerful force to help for them to maintain their presence and their dominance in their particular societies.
Now, China's also present in Africa. However, China seems to focus mainly on building up infrastructure and providing loans. Is this a better approach to helping African nations, or is this also simply another form of colonialism?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and is something that's being hotly debated. And as you said in your question, that there is a different kind of approach from the Chinese in Africa. One can argue, and people can discuss what their objectives may be, their intent, but for many of the African governments and for most of the African people, when you have a situation where you have investment in infrastructure, roads, bridges, food production, the land, as opposed to an investment in terms of militarism, I think most of the African people would opt for the investment in infrastructure to improve the quality of people's lives. So while we know that all nations have their own particular national interests, we know that the Chinese, in building their global One Belt, One Road project, they are attempting to integrate nations into their orbit of influence. But the approach is fundamentally different from that of the U.S. and NATO. And part of the reason why we see this dramatic expansion of U.S. militarism on the African continent is, in fact, to put a brake, if you will, on the influence of the Chinese. So the U.S. is using its military might in order to try to break the Chinese hold on the African continent.
Yep. Now, we've seen anti-war protests over U.S. military activities in the Middle East. Why don't we see many concerning Africa?
Well, because I think that, as we said earlier, most people are not even aware of the fact that we have this growing presence on the African continent. We saw that when the U.S. and NATO attacked Libya, there was not only a lack of opposition, but there was overwhelming support. And part of that support was because if Obama and the U.S. administration target a particular state like Libya, then there must be some kind of moral and political justification for that. So again, it is the bipartisan support for U.S. militarism. It is the abandonment on the part of the so-called liberals to the permanent war agenda, and is even the abandonment of opposition to war and militarism by significant sectors of the so-called left or the radical left in the U.S. So part of our objective, part of our historic task is to try to reverse the advantages that now the state has in convincing people that war is in their best interest.
Thank you, Manji. It's been my pleasure. We'll have you on again. Appreciate it.
Definitely. Definitely. Thank you so much.